Welcome to another edition of the Corner Booth Podcast here from the Stoughton Delicatessen Restaurant. I'm Aaron Rand along with Leslie Chesterman and Bill Brownstein, and our special guest today, Benoît Dubreuil. Welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
For those who don't know, it's maybe a face you haven't seen a whole lot. Benoît Dubreuil is now the first ever Commissioner of the French language in the province of Quebec. So when I say the first ever, my first question, Benoît, maybe this is not fair. We have a minister of the French language. We have an Office québécois de la langue française. Why do we need a commissioner of the French language?
Very good question. So the situation we had prior to Bill 96 was that we had an additional organization that was called the Conseil supérieur de la langue française that had existed since 1977. And that was basically providing advice to the government, advice to the minister concerning big questions about the evolution of language. So what Bill 96 has done is abolish this council and kind of replace it by this new position of the French language commissioner that instead of reporting to the minister will report directly to the National Assembly. So the organization is about the same size. Part of the mandate is the same, but it has more teeth to actually have a control function and monitoring function over what the government is doing.
So when you say monitoring and then reporting to the National Assembly as a whole, what exactly are you monitoring? I mean, what makes that up? What are you checking? What are you looking for? And what will you be reporting on?
Yeah, that very good question. Like the Act sets out a number of things that I need to look at, including what parliamentary institutions are doing. A lot of it also is about the learning and use of French language by people who join our society. Part of it is the programs and obligations of the Office québécois de la langue française, of the Ministère de la langue française, just to make sure that they are doing their work properly, that they are implementing their duty correctly in function of the charter. So those are the very specific things, but at the same time it gives some kind of broad power to basically look at pretty much any aspect of the evolution of the linguistic situation in Quebec and provide recommendation to either the government or the National Assembly. So it's both very specific and very broad, and that's part of the challenge, I think.
Okay.
Immigration is something that you've spoken up about in the past. You've written about that you think that too much immigration here could have a negative impact on French. Is that? Could you elaborate?
Yeah. So immigration obviously is not the only question that is interesting when we talk about French. Obviously, it is a bit the topic of the hour because it took a lot of place in recent debate, recent election campaign. So maybe to summarize my view about this is that we are starting, if we go back, let's go back to the 50s and 60s where we had the situation where vast majority of immigrants were opting for English, were very attracted to English. There was this kind of segmentation in society between Francophones and Anglophones who were bosses and workers. Then came the Charter of French Language and somehow very significantly changed the situation with children of immigrants, but with immigrants also themselves. And we entered a situation in the 80s, in the 90s, where immigrants were much more likely to opt for French, but not necessarily at the level that we find in the rest of society. I think since the early 2000s, there has been a bit of a shift also, mainly related to changing the composition of immigration. That's where we start seeing a lot of people coming from North Africa, for instance, who tend to opt French very, very often. And this also kind of helped closing the gap between immigrants and the rest of society. And if we look at the last census data, there has been a further decline, maybe 10%, but I think it will probably be temporary, and we are likely to go back to where we were between 2001 and 2015. And then there are further changes that are proposed by the government on immigration policy, and one of my responsibility will be to look at how it will affect the propension of immigrants to opt for either French or English or both.
So I know that in your first report, you talked about something that is obviously an issue when we ever discuss this, which is the language you're speaking at home. And a lot of people, the attitude is, wait a sec, the government has no business in my home to find out, number one, or tell me what I can or can't speak at home.
Yeah.
What you mentioned this, you brought this up in the report. Why is this a concern?
Yeah, well, I think when you look at the history of immigration, not only in Quebec, but in North America, you see like a process that is very well established where immigrants, first generation, they tend to adopt, like vast majority of them, the dominant language in public, right? So it's English everywhere in North America, French and English here. And then second generation, they tend to adopt and to bring these language at home. And third generation, it becomes the first language of children. So I'm not very worried. Like if we maintain the presence of French in public, I'm not very worried that in the long run things will end up balancing out, even if people at home speak another language. And the other point I think that you're raising is also right. I mean, when we're developing language policy, there are limitations to what we can do, right? Because at some point people do have right to intimacy, do have a right to preserve their private sphere. It doesn't mean that we should not be interested in people's behavior and that we cannot study it and we should not be getting a full picture of what is going on. But obviously when we talk of action, there are limitations to what we can do that would respect people's private sphere.
You know, I'm beginning to wonder, or at least I think Anglos, by virtue of what we hear, are beginning to wonder whether there really are limitations, how far a government, I realize you're not part of the government, but how far a government could or would go in restricting that access. We know now in June 1st, in Bill 96, suddenly if you want to receive or continue to receive government services in English, you need a good faith attestation as an Anglo, or you can be Indigenous or live out of the province. That just seems like one step, and I know the government has said, well, you know what, we'll let this go for a year, and if we have to adjust, we will. But just the fact that that's now introduced is a reason for concern for Anglos. So I'm wondering, are there limitations? You said there are, in terms of what a government can do to protect or promote French?
Yeah, I mean, I think your question has two components. One of them is like, what would be the right end situation that we would try to achieve in terms of the overall balance between French and English. And the second one is like, in terms of individual freedoms, are there actually boundaries to what the government can do, right? So in the first case, I think there is some form of balanced situation that we should be looking at. It's true that when you look at history, what happened is that like in the 80s and the 90s, French achieved to make progress, okay, and even to maintain its place, and even in the early 2000s, even if it was not like attracting as many immigrants that would have been needed. And the answer, you know why, it's because a lot of Anglophones were leaving, right? So that's also part of the picture. When we look at the overall balance, I think what we would like to have in terms of a situation is one in which young Anglophones are not massively leaving the province, or Anglophones are not massively leaving the province, and at the same time where immigrants who are coming in basically opt for French and English in proportions that are similar to what you have in the rest of society. So for me, that would be the type of balanced situation that I would like to see. I don't think we are exactly there. The other question is in terms of limitation to private life, and that's a tough question because there's whole jurisprudence that exists in terms of individual rights. It says that like if you end up applying a constraint, then it needs to be reasonable and it needs to be proportionate to the objective that you're trying to achieve. So that's typically what courts are looking when and lawyers are looking when they think of these issues. Like, does it make sense in terms of what you're trying to achieve, and is it proportionate, like the limitations that you're imposing, is it proportionate to the goal that you will achieve?
The Corner Booth podcast is brought to you in part by the Snowden Deli, serving Montrealers since 1946 and home of the city's best smoked meat sandwich, the Snowden Deli, DeCarry Boulevard, north of Queen Mary Road.
The interesting thing to me is, having lived here all my life, having grown up here, the cultural climate has so totally changed, whereas I agree that back in the old days, the stereotype of the blue-haired like woman at Eaton's who only served in English, that's changed. Like my kids, all the kids, they went to school in French, they all work in French, and they live here. And I think, I know there's this, we all want to protect the French language. I don't know an Anglo who doesn't, but those of us who have stayed, and I think on a level, there was a study that came out and said like that 90% of people in Montreal, like Anglos, are able to carry on conversations in French as well as in English. And I think that's changed dramatically from the bad old years when, you know, there was a real schism, there was a real divide. And I think people are sometimes puzzled, Anglos, because they think, they're being viewed as the enemy when they are trying to make an effort to fit. I mean, to the point where, well, okay, perhaps not at home with like two Anglos talking to themselves in bed. I mean, that's one thing. But I think there's been a real shift. I don't know if you see that.
Obviously, like I think the 90% is the overall population
Yes.
in Montreal who are able to have a conversation in French. No, obviously, I mean it's always a matter of what's the baseline with which we're comparing. Like if you compare to the situation before, there has been a dramatic shift in the both the attitude and the skills of Anglophones' capacity to use French and the fact of actually using it in everyday life. And the overall Anglo population, like in terms of first language, and even like it is not growing, right? So I think the question is really what choices will people who join our society will make. And the thing is also that there is a significant proportion of immigrants who arrive. And I mean, we have in Quebec like two public language, French and English, that are official language in something like 100 countries, right, around the world. So a lot of people who arrive here already have like prior exposure to one language or the other, and a lot of them already actually speak it and already use it as vehicular. So obviously it creates a situation where people arrive, they're put in front of a choice. Some of them know very well French, know virtually no English. Other people know very good English, no French, and other people are very fluent in both. And it creates a situation where there's a competition. There's not a competition everywhere. There are things that you need to do in French in Quebec, or like mostly do in French. There are other things that you mostly have to do in English, but you have all those other circumstances in between where you basically have the choice. And the preference of the people who arrive, who join society, actually changes the mix over time. But I fully recognize what you're saying. I mean, there has been a dramatic shift. So I don't know if I answer your question.
Yeah, no, you
there's
do.
An aspect that I...
No, but what's very interesting is that also the Anglos have stayed here. I mean, we could have gone to Toronto, got jobs elsewhere. We stay here because we love it here. We do love living here. I mean, for all the issues that we have, and it's not just language. It's like going. We love it here, and yet I think we always have to persuade people that we are at home here. Look, my family arrived here in the late 1800s. You know, it's always been the home. Those who left because they didn't feel comfortable. I'm not comfortable. I couldn't live in Saskatchewan. I couldn't live in Ontario. I mean, this is home.
Yeah. No, I understand. Maybe one thing that I could add also is that when we compare the situation to what we had like several decades ago, is that the situation in many ways is much less polarized. Like you do have people on the English-speaking sides who are more typical of the old Anglos, and on the French-speaking side you also have the equivalent. But you really have a big mass of people in between that are really on a continuum, and I think that has changed in many ways. And one of my surprises since I've been appointed is the number of people with whom I speak, and I just realized that they have no preconceived ideas at all about these language debate, which is kind of surprising for us who grew up like in a situation where those debates were much more tense. But when we look at the younger generation, they just don't have any preconceived ideas. They really look at this from a fresh new eye. Typically they are bilingual or they aspire to become bilingual, and they're open to having discussions about how we could arrange things in a way that would be fair for everyone. So like this also give me hope. I don't think we need to...
I have a question regarding exactly that, because I have two kids, and when I asked them about that, they said that for them, the issues that we had as young Anglophones in Montreal of everybody beating each other up don't exist anymore, and that that has changed dramatically. However, what is your take on bilingualism? Because there's a lot of pushback about bilingualism, especially for French kids to learn English, because I think all of us who have young kids in Quebec want them to learn French. My kids went to French school, but I find that there is a huge pushback from the Francophone, especially the Legault government, about encouraging young Quebecers to learn English. And secondly, which is really, I think, the biggest challenge you have, is how are you going to make it interesting or attractive for young people to not go to the American culture, to not be influenced by the English culture, because that's what they're doing. I have two young kids. They're always on YouTube. They're not listening to anything in French, and there are a lot of French-Canadian kids who are not listening to anything in French either.
And I would add that this might not be only a challenge for from a linguistic point perspective, because a lot of francophones today I see are turning to English, spends 2,
Yes.
3, 4 hours on YouTube,
Yep.
and that's really a big change from what I saw, like the generation in which
Sure.
I grew up. Like it was not possible, right? It did not exist. So now there is a big shift. But one of the things that is of worry, I think, for you too, is that these people are not necessarily reading the Gazette, are not necessarily listening to Montreal Now.
Even
So-
Canadian, they're not.
No,
America
yeah.
is the biggest
So,
threat.
I mean, for
really.
Quebec now, I think there is a bit, like I speak to a lot of parents, French-speaking parents today, and we are all very much surprised by the consumer habit of our kids. And it's not only English. Also, my kids, for instance, it's a lot of content coming from France.
Absolutely,
And I love
yeah.
content coming from France. I love French people. But
But
at the same time, I mean, you
not our
still
culture.
need to be aware of what is going on in your neighborhood, right? But I think this is pretty interesting and also help us maybe go beyond some of the debates we had traditionally, because at the end of the day, I mean, you choose to live here. I also had times in my life where I could have chosen to go elsewhere. I decided to be here. So we've all decided to be here.
Right.
So at some point we have institutions, we have a life in common. So the question of culture is about language, but it's also about, like, do we actually want to share something, or we just want to be exposed to content coming from the four corners of the world and
But
not
it-
knowing what is
But
going
you know,
on.
But
to-
is that
to-
part of your job to try to make French
That's,
more appealing to young people? Because to me,
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but
Yeah.
I'm a huge Francophile. We speak French and English at home.
Yeah, yeah.
I think you're fighting a bit of a losing battle. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, but I think that is a massive challenge.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it's a shame.
Yeah, but I think something really changed, and it's not since a long time, right? It's really with the
Yeah.
invention of the smartphones and
Internet, yeah.
and platforms, and like during 10 years, it's like things change from one to the other. So I'm not sure what's the answer to that, but I think debates about the role of platforms in our life, the role of GAFAM in our life, how they structure the public debate, how they influence democracy. I think at some point it can be a discussion about language, but at some point it will also lead to a discussion about these broader issues, which are
Yeah.
increasingly top of the agenda.
Right.
So let me take this to the next point to suggest further on what Leslie's bringing up. If the issue, we hear from the Premier all the time that line about, the French language is in peril, and if you want to extend that, French culture is in peril. I'm starting to wonder if we get to the point when we talk about limitations where, a government will look at this and say, you know what, we've done what we can in terms of making the province as French as we possibly can, signage, speaking, etc. And just because we can't seem to get over that hump from the internet, from social media, now you will no longer have access somehow to media from someplace other than here.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there is a big
I don't see that happening. But
It's
who knows?
It's happened other places.
Yeah, I think the bigger risk that we have is if we reach a point where all our information are controlled by GAFAM and by algorithms, that we do not have some
yes.
governance culture at some point, and we've seen this in other countries, how it could bring people to move towards certain directions. So I think that's probably the bigger challenge. But like, I just forgot the first part of your.
No, I'm asking if that limitation could extend to the point where, a government would say,
Drastic
you know
measures,
what?
drastic-
Yeah.
No more
No.
U.S., no more English, no
No,
more
no,
international.
I don't think it
It'd be
could.
very hard to enforce.
Yeah, exactly, because basically.
No
and
more
that's-
going to Florida in the winter.
Yeah, that's the problem. I mean, we like algorithms, right? We all like algorithms. They give us what we prefer. They create this
They tell
environment.
us what we prefer.
Yeah, Francophones are very engaged
like them,
on
but-
social media as
Yeah,
well.
so I mean, I think it's a much broader issue.
I want to know, too, to the point where, this whole idea, and Leslie brought up bilingualism.
Yes, bilingualism.
If you
Oh,
take
yeah.
Montreal
That-
and
yeah.
factor every other part of the province out, it's not an issue anywhere other than Montreal. Right?
well-
That seems to be the concern. This is where big business is.
Yeah.
This is the big part of the financial part of the province.
Situation in Gatineau could raise
yes,
some
yes.
issue. You
Of
have,
course.
and it's partly linked to housing and the place of the federal government. I think there's
Okay.
a discussion also that we should have about Gatineau, especially in recent years, that extend to the broader question of the language of work and the place of French in the federal public service, because that's an extension of this debate. But yes, you're right. I mean, it's pretty much about Montreal, because if you're outside of Montreal, it would be much harder not to use French in the
Sure.
public
Yeah,
in the public domain.
But to that point, a lot of Anglos see something called wedge politics, where the people that say the present government or others like are appealing to are people who live outside of Montreal. In fact, most of the support for the current government comes from outside of Montreal, and they see this as basically an issue to, get their base fired up on a certain level, that there's a decline. And as they mentioned, like, the issue would be most like in Montreal, where these people aren't. And you would think that if that was the case, that the government would be more popular in Montreal.
Yeah, I don't want to comment on electoral strategy of the different parties, but I think everybody, including francophones in Montreal, do have like a perspective and are interested in the debate, francophones and anglophones. So I'm not sure it is I think there is some linguistic divide in people's preferences, but yeah. So I'm not sure.
It was also very interesting. The Grand Prix last weekend came, and I did a piece on the street speaking to American tourists, and I was happy to discover, or maybe even a little bit surprised, language was never an issue whatsoever. They were
Because they don't live here.
No, but I'm talking about in terms of getting services here in Montreal.
Right.
Getting service in English,
And getting service in English, not one complained. I mean, and we have to understand that this is a tourist city, as London is, as Paris is.
But on that note, sorry, but we're taking over the conversation now. On that note, that's a lot of reason that people come to Montreal, because it's a francophone.
Exactly.
They say, I can't afford to go to Paris, let's go to Montreal.
And they
the
love
food's
it,
better.
but yet they're speaking English, and they say they have no problem.
But that is a huge draw that we can't lose here too. Language is as much of a draw, but when they get here, maybe they want directions in. But back to the bilingual. You are beautifully bilingual. You're perfectly bilingual. Do you want your children to be bilingual?
Oh, I mean, I'm extremely surprised by how much bilingual they are, because I never paid any attention to teaching them English, and they're much better than I was at their age. So
they're watching YouTube.
From watching from social media.
Yeah. It's really social media. I mean, they're not mainly looking things in English.
But you want them to be bilingual?
Obviously, everyone wants to be bilingual, and I mean,
Premier Legault does not want to be bilingual.
No, that well, I'm not going to.
Pauline Marois never really wanted.
But I think the thing with bilingualism is that, like, I mean, we need to be making the difference between what is good for the individual and what impact it has when you aggregate individual behavior. Because the issue with learning each other's language is that the more you learn the other person's language, the more you reduce the incentive of other people to learn your language, right? And that's the problem that minority are facing. Like in Quebec, it's not too dramatic. I mean, French is a large language, influential world language. Like, take, for instance, indigenous languages, right? They're in much more dramatic situations. So they are increasingly wanting to be bilingual, but becoming bilingual, what incentive people have who want to learn their... So that's really the trick with bilingualism. So people tend to see, like, oh, you want language policy, so it means that you don't want to have bilingualism, and that's not the case.
Right.
Like, the more bilingual we are, the more reflections we have.
But the thought process is that once kids start to learn English, it's the gateway to giving up on French.
Yeah, I think it depends. Like, traditionally, it has not been the case. I think now we are entering a new world that I don't understand fully, and I still need to understand what are the implications of, because like I saw this article in the Devoir a couple of weeks ago about kids in Nunavik, right, who were entering school speaking better English than Inuktitut.
Right.
And basically it's 3 or 4 hours of YouTube per day, and you end up not being able to speak your language properly. Yeah. So I think we are entering a new world.
Right. And English is easier than French, like it or not.
Oh, no.
I've done both. Oh,
no,
my God.
no. I think
I still can't. Les phrases avec si. Forget it.
No,
proper French is difficult.
Roman languages are difficult for the verbal tenses, right? That's the challenge. But the challenge with English that people don't notice is the how do you call it? The tonal accent. That's hard. That's really hard for francophones, because in French
it's not as hard as male and female for the French side.
But at the same time, it has no implication to be understood by people, right?
True.
Yeah.
So, let me ask one thing. We're going to run out of time, and I want to just go to a point that I think maybe you could answer. I'm not sure. The Premier has often said, this is a recurring theme in this government, the French language is in peril. Mm-hmm. When you take over, when you have this job as Commissioner of the French language, is that your starting point? Acknowledging that it already is in peril and trying to find proof that it is? Or where's the starting point for you?
Yeah, so for me, the challenge is really, the French is declining with respect to a number of indicators, and it has implication, right? It is growing according to the overall number of people who can speak French and who use French, but it is also declining, for instance, in the public sphere. I think in the workplace, the last census has given data that are a source of concern. The challenge for me is to manage to describe the glass, which is half full, half empty, in a way that makes sense for everyone and helps creating some common ground for the discussion to be rational, help kind of channel the discussion on a basic understanding of the facts. But
yet at the same time, we pointed out, I think Bill brought up that figure of 90% of people here are able to carry on a conversation in French. So you have that on one side, and the idea that French is in peril on the other side.
So basically,
how does that work?
So basically you have like different levels. Like you have people who speak French at home, people who use French in the public sphere, and people who know French, right? So I think just looking at the number of people who know French is probably not enough for me, right? Because you can be in a situation like I worked in Ottawa for many years, and I was in countless meetings where 90% of the people around the table could speak very good French, and 98% of the meeting was in English.
Right,
so
right.
you can have this, like the number of people or the proportion of people who know the language is not a perfect indicator of how good you will be in the position you will
How
be
much
of
it's
actually
being
using
used,
it,
yes.
right? You can be in a situation where a large proportion of people know it, but you won't be able to use it. So that's why we need to look at how it is used, how people preferences also evolve, and how all this interact to keep some form of balance and a situation that is overall fair, right? That I think that's the overall objective. It's not.
And do you have a firm number in terms of when we get to this level, I'm satisfied that I've solved the problem?
The problem we have is that historically, I think I mentioned it earlier, but it's the fact that there's interprovincial migration also that kind of complexifies the issue. The fact that people who were speaking English or immigrants that were opting for English had a propension to leave the province more, and this kind of helped keeping French at the higher level. So when we talk about immigration, I have this figure that I would like I think I mentioned 85%. It's probably a good guess, right? 85 for French, 15 for English. That would be probably the right number just for immigration. But then there's the question of interprovincial migration, and there's the other question that we mentioned of what happens within among non-immigrants, right? Because the views are also changing, and it raises the questions that are totally different of like the way we want to structure our social life, our relationship with media and culture. So these questions are interconnected.
You know, it's very interesting that, I don't know if you saw, you must have seen this, when you were appointed, we had an op-ed piece in the Gazette endorsing you as a friend to the English.
Oh, was it Phil Autier?
Really?
No, it wasn't Phil Autier, it was David Johnson.
Oh yeah, okay. I don't know. It's hard because we are in a debate where a lot of people have very, very strong views, and one. I think I will be successful if I can put things in a way that makes sense for everyone without antagonizing too much and without like minimizing the issues, and that's really the challenge.
Yet at the same time, when you were appointed, the Liberals opposed your appointment, right? Mark
Tanguay
got up and said, "No, we don't like this." Based on a book you had written 12 years earlier, I'm just curious
with the
how that made you feel.
your support of Parizeau, he brought up.
So I don't want to comment his exact comment. So as I said in earlier interviews, I would have liked to have unanimity.
You believe Jacques Parizeau was right when he did that? Lobsters in a pot comment, ethnic votes, etc.
No, I'm not going to comment on what Parizeau said at the time.
But you did.
Yeah, I mean, he was quoting a book that is available for people to read, and the Liberals made their comments on this. So I just don't want to get into this more kind of political debate about the interpretation of things, because I think it will really deviate me from my mandate. Right.
Yeah. Could I make a suggestion as a bilingual Montrealer? If you're looking,
do you take suggestions?
Do you take suggestions?
Yeah, I love suggestions.
I find this idea of the two solitudes, it maybe is disappearing a little bit, but it's still very much there.
Yeah.
And I think the government, instead of really putting kind of I think we feel as Anglophones that we're kind of, there's the undertone of the enemy and we're the problem.
Targeted, right?
Yeah, targeted. But I think the government should maybe work on not only glorifying the French language, making it, appealing. I don't want to use the word sexy, but also maybe looking for more ways to bring the two communities together.
Yeah.
Because, I dated a lot of French Canadian men. So I'm not saying you should have like a dating
still are.
service, but really we don't know each other.
Yeah.
We don't know each other well enough, and there are great things to learn from. And I'm always sad when I see Anglophones who don't partake in French culture,
Yeah.
and the opposite too. So I think there have to be more outreach programs from the government to bring people together to learn about each other than constantly pulling us apart.
No,
And
that's
on the other side of things, I got to tell you how amusing it is, how often me as an Anglo will speak to another Anglo in French
Yes.
because we
Yeah.
assume that the other.
And we keep going.
And we keep going.
'Cause we're
and
scared.
having conversations. And the interesting thing is, neither of us are aware.
yeah. No, that's true. I think like compulsory schooling for that came with the Bill 101. I think it really helped French in many ways. But at the same time, it really put like the English-speaking community a bit aside.
Right.
And I'm not sure that we have developed like the right mechanisms to make these connections. So that's a good point.
All right, we're going to have to wrap it up. Benoît Dubreuil, thank you so much for joining us today. We
Thanks for
appreciate it.
inviting me.
That
It's a
wraps up
pleasure.
another edition of the Corner Booth Podcast. We'll see you again soon.